Well, from this we can learn some fairly direct and important things about African agriculture. In fact, about the future of agriculture as a whole throughout the world. Humankind cannot survive future trajectories of the current global agricultural system because of several reasons. One, current practices do not solve the problem of human hunger. Instead, these practices accentuate global and national income inequality and generate the basis for expanded social strife, military conflict, and the syndromes of warfare, migration, and rural income collapse. In the process, these practices effectively expand the absolute numbers of global poor and generate hunger faster than they can meet the needs of the growing number of the world's hungry populations. Secondly, current practices deplete topsoil, destroy biodiversity, pollute the air, and poison declining water supplies, all of which are needed in abundant and increasing, not decreasing, supply to provide for stable or growing agricultural production over the long term across the world. Third, current practices are predicated upon an increased, not diminished, consumption of fossil fuels for the production, harvesting, transport, storage, distribution, and preparation of food supplies around the world. Thus, humanity's primary production systems have come to function within a global food system that is irretrievably dependent on non-renewables. Think about that for a moment. Becoming dependent upon non-renewables effectively guarantees that humanity's food system will in time not be renewed. You can't have a renewable agriculture based on non-renewable resources. Can't happen, won't happen. Finally, the increasing self-destructive character of this petro-intensive model of agriculture is based upon the futile attempt to work with simple metaphors of market economics in a vastly more complex global ecosystem. Yes, market economics have a role to play in any agricultural system, but in the final analysis, market economics cannot provide the operative logic for any stable and functioning ecosystem because that system cannot be rigged for the principal benefit of just one of its constituent species. Humans are part of an ecosystem. They don't stand apart from the ecosystem. In short, humankind cannot survive future trajectories of the current global agricultural system because the Borlaug-Gates petro-intensive agricultural strategies will not work for humankind, simply because they cannot work within a functioning and enduring global agro-ecosystem. Borlaug plus Gates, now extended by the billions of dollars that Gates brings to the issue, will lead to a disaster. And this is precisely what scientists are beginning to point out. This mistake has been made dramatically apparent to the world by Vandana Shiva and Anuradha Mittal, two Indian scholars, who have made it clear in a series of books about soil not oil, the violence of the Green Revolution, and the like, plus a series of studies and speeches on the depredations of land grabs in Africa and elsewhere. It's interesting that the strongest defenders of African smallholder agriculture are from the Indian continent because they've seen the dysfunction of the Green Revolution technology among Indian farmers who were out in the tens of thousands on the streets in the middle of the global pandemic demonstrating against the current government in India's attempts to expand Green Revolution technology, finance, and marketing. Vandana Shiva is clear that the kind of agriculture designed by the world's billionaires will destroy biodiversity the world's smallhold farmers, and ultimately the global food supply itself. Instead, she argues restorative agriculture based on indigenous knowledge systems and solar energy throughput, not extractive agriculture based on petroleum and market imperatives, must come to become the norm if we are going to survive as a species. She's been talking about protecting the planet and the destructive impact of billionaires. Very important set of studies. So, in short, Africa's multiple food crises have been aggravated in recent years by a fluctuating but generally rising price of petroleum, the diversion of global grain stocks toward the production of biofuel instead of exported maize, the emergence of land grabs with the design of installing large-scale petro-intensive agriculture for export in the tropics, a massive international government and foundation-funded pressure to adopt green revolution technology, the effective control of seed stocks by large landholders and agropharmaceutical firms like Monsanto and Bayer aspirin, as it were, buying out Monsanto, the uncertain but somewhat predictable impact of a changing climate throughout the continent of Africa, creating droughts and famines that disrupt all agriculture, and the even more uncertain but perhaps even more predictable disruptions to customary activity caused by COVID-19 and the responses to it, and other new and resurgent disease burdens that are emerging now in Africa. This didn't used to be this way. If you take the long view of African agricultural history, what the French call l'histoire de la longue durée, championed by historians like Fernand Braudel, it was very clear that for centuries, Africa exported agricultural food surpluses and the manpower that fueled the international Atlantic slave trade system. We're just now beginning to understand this with the remote views that can be brought into focus from satellite pictures. Africa was very well endowed because it has the biggest space of any continents available for the capture of solar energy. Carefully preserved and now publicly available digitized map collections of Africa make some of these prior plantations, the ones that preceded the plantations in the New World, the prior plantations in Africa are now visible and can be studied on some of these older maps. Students and scholars from all over the world have begun to explore these unwritten documents for their embedded ecological information. A group like the Africa Map Circle has begun to share this with the digitization of maps and the discussion across any language and national barriers of the rich documentation available on African agriculture over several hundred years. Perhaps we should conclude then with some thoughts from the past. Dan McCall started it. In thinking about Africa in time perspective, we would do well to recall the insights of Dan McCall. One of the functions of history, some writers claim, and I agree with them, he said, is to help the individual to define his personality, to see himself in the stream of humanity. For a nation as well, it helps to indicate its character and its place in the world community. If it is true, and if it is also true that we can no longer remain half free and half unfree, then it can no longer continue half historic and half ahistoric. We need to understand Africa's history in order to understand humanity's future. As he points out, if it is also true that the world cannot longer remain half free and half unfree, then it can no longer continue half historic and half ahistoric. As he did in 1961 by writing, "I have tried not to betray history, and I make no apology for my own opinion, but I set forth my vision of what historiography is becoming." A new African historiography is needed in reference to agriculture. This was written 60 years ago. It's now time to undertake the task. Because of Dan's insight and inspiration, many of us are encouraged to look at the history through an ecological lens, studying things like maps, stones, and plants, and the individual agents of empire and the ecology of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, 60 years later, African historiography can fully contribute to the age-old narrative of human ecological history, with wave upon wave of scrambles, disasters, and some notable achievements. Achievements have a lot to do with the plants and empire, with the history of bioprospecting, and with the newly emerging ecological science of colonial expansion. One dimension of this new approach to African history is to acknowledge and explore the long-standing connection between agriculture and violence in African history ever since 1492. We're accustomed to hearing Vandana Shiva point out the connection between agriculture and the violence of the Green Revolution, but we've been somewhat less used to studying violence historically from the very earliest maps of the Africa trade. It now appears that violence is baked into the history of the encounter with Africa and the Atlantic system. The study of African historical cartography in important European archival collections makes this theme stunningly apparent. In the Africa Map Circle, we've been able to undertake some of these studies during the COVID moment by sharing things online, digitally, across national borders. Consider, for example, the new collection that's been identified and is going to be presented by Balliol College in Oxford. There is going to be, in September, a courageous exhibit planned by one of Oxford's most prestigious colleges. The Balliol Historical Collections is putting on a display they're entitling Slavery in the Age of Revolution. And they put out a very tantalizing trailer about it. Let's have a look. Because of its long and illustrious history, Balliol College is uniquely well placed to undertake this kind of long-term, large-scale reassessment of African history, and perhaps of European history as well. Balliol College was founded in 1263. It's hard for Americans to understand the depth of that history. This was long before the rise of the European Atlantic empires, and in fact, before the discovery of, quote, the New World by Columbus and others. So the document collections of Balliol College contain rich materials illustrating the truly global aspects of European empire throughout its tradition of overseas expansion. In this forthcoming exhibit alone, for example, the ships pictured in the video clip from the Balliol College collection come from an 1826 sketch of the New York harbor. We don't usually think of this as something linked to Africa, but they're very directly linked in collections like those of Balliol College in Oxford. While other original documents in their collection relate to Africa, Barbados, and Haiti in the Atlantic system. Early maps of Africa. A clear indication, in fact, an unbelievable capturing of the violence involved in this development of a transatlantic plantation system, dependent upon plantations in Africa to grow the food, to transport the manpower, thousands of miles to be put to work on plantations in the New World. These prior plantations have to be considered and are brought into sharp focus by collections like those in Balliol College, which contain information about Barbados and the West Indies, along with their information about Africa. And, as you might expect, Haiti in the Atlantic system, which is going to be part of their display of material on slavery in the age of revolution. It was the Haiti Revolution, not just the North American Revolutionary War for independence, that comes in focus in the collections of places like Balliol College. The history of Balliol College is also tied intimately to the rise of later European overseas empires because it was the college in Oxford of the distinguished economist, Scottish economist, brought to Balliol on a Snell Fellowship. And this economist went on to write The Wealth of Nations, sometimes considered the cornerpiece of overseas European expansion. More recently, under the mastership of Sir Drummond Bone, the college has looked at its economic history in the sense of examining the economists who have worked at the college over the years on the rise and impending demise of neoliberal market fundamentalism. Balliol is currently under the leadership of Master Dame Helen Gosh. She's an accomplished and decorated former civil servant in Britain and someone with a long career of commitment to the importance of preserving the historical record. It may well be that Balliol's example in sharing its slave history archives will serve as an inspiration to other colleges at Oxford, Cambridge, London, and indeed on the continent, in France, in Portugal, in Spain, and perhaps as well in Germany, and provide collections from their similar historical treasures, similar to those found at Balliol and other places in England. It's with these maps and then with the archaeologists' contributions from the study of stone structures and the ethnobotanists working on the introduction of plants, that we can learn a lot about the agents of empire and the ecology of the Atlantic trade. In any event, whether or not Balliol's example is followed, it is clear, particularly at this moment, the entire continent of Africa and the world as a whole will benefit from the sharing of this kind of deep documentation that Balliol is undertaking. The reason for this is that the world is now once again witnessing a new scramble for Africa. This isn't my phrase. It isn't a figment of my imagination. I'm not making it up. It's a phrase commonly used by economists in, for example, The Economist magazine. The new scramble for Africa and how Africans can win it. Well, that's quite rich as an idea. What does it mean? How can Africans win it? What does it mean to win the scramble for Africa? Not clear. We should remember the words of Joseph Conrad in their full context in his 1902 novel. As he put it, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only. An idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. Something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. That's what Joseph Conrad said of empire in 1902. It was an idea you could set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. The sacrifice that was offered was the African continent itself and the African peoples who were victimized by this idea of colonial improvement. Nowadays, there's a new idea. In our day, the new idea is sustainable development. It's advocated by many of Africa's most articulate elites and many of their allies in the African American and African American expatriate community. Sustainable development. A great idea. It's being put forward, in fact, as part of the True African University, sponsored in part by MIT these days. Sustainable development in Africa is their theme for meeting this year. The trouble is that there's nothing sustainable about the development that is being championed with petro-intensive agriculture. No matter how many times you use the phrase, you don't achieve the reality if you build into the agricultural plans for the future in Africa further dependence on petro-intensive agriculture. So the question that has to be put honestly to the True Africa University and MIT, its sponsor, is what is meant by sustainable development in Africa if it's merely going to replicate and expand petro-intensive agriculture. This is why it's important to look at the troubling chapters in the political ecology and history of West African agriculture. Look at the prior plantations that were involved and had to be involved in creating the foodstuffs for the transatlantic trade. Then look at the history of legitimate trade during the 19th century after the abolition of slavery. Then let's examine the cash crop production during the entire colonial era, aimed at exporting crops like cocoa, coffee, bananas, everything you eat for breakfast, basically, comes out of the tropics in an export-oriented economy focused on extraction. The current chapters, of course, are the farmland grabs that we've been looking at. These are troubling issues. Thank you very much for coming along and examining them with us. Special thanks are due to Eric Schmidt, Fallow and Gum, Elsa Vihe, Dr. Gerald Rizzo, and Lucia Levinson Golob. They, in fact, direct and staff the Aphitera collection, the cartographic free library that's been very helpful in this research. Dr. Rizzo has amassed an enormous collection and made a lot of it available to international scholars in digitized form. We all owe him a great debt. He's been an active member of the African Map Circle and helped launch the meeting at the African Studies Association last year. In addition, Beth Resnick, Gabi Adunya, and Rachel Dwyer deserve thanks for their help in the library. Ellen Messer, over the years, has provided guidance and insight from her own work in food and nutrition issues around the world. And the entire group, known as the Africa Map Circle, deserve thanks for their assistance as well. And of course, the students, scholars, and colleagues over the years in Yale's, Harvard's, and BU's African Studies programs all deserve thanks. This is part of an ongoing series of research projects on Africa's industrial revolution and the Atlantic empires, the prior plantations, and the origins and functioning of the Atlantic system. Africa's prior plantations supplied both the food and manpower for 4 centuries to create and sustain multiple European empires in the Atlantic. It's referred to as Africa's industrious revolution because it wasn't an industrial revolution. It was based on sheer human manpower, not the use of draft animals for the most part. And yet it's that manpower that created the crops, and built the forts and the entire infrastructure for the export agriculture and the export of manpower over the Atlantic for tens of millions of people. This is ongoing research that needs to take into account both the historical cartography, the forthcoming archaeology of the different forts and garden plots, and in fact, entire plantations that supply the food for the transatlantic trip. These then are some of the troubling chapters in the political ecology and history of West African agriculture. The prior plantations, legitimate trade, cash crop exports, and farmland grabs. They're all part of a continuous history. And they're troubling chapters to begin with and to end with. Dan McCall inspired some of this research to begin with his emphasis and appeal for further works in ethnobotany. Other agronomists like René Dumont underscored the fact that Africa could develop, but it was taking a wrong start in the early 60s, growing without developing. And of course, historians have underscored how Europe underdeveloped Africa precisely by emphasizing export agriculture in cash crops, while Africa as a whole came to depend upon imports of foodstuffs. So this is something that takes a look at the full sweep of agrohistory in West Africa, and will continue for years to come as further archaeology, historical cartography, and detailed study of the agricultural policies of colonial empires continues.